Welcome to the O Show, your number one podcast for everything training, mindset, and nutrition. I am your host, Oren McCarry, and it is my goal to help you access the best information around to allow you to kick ass in the gym, in the kitchen, and most importantly, in your head. Between my own experiences and those of my amazing guests, I'm confident we will do that. So let's strap in and level up your life starting right now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys. Welcome to today's episode of the O Show podcast. I am your host, Oren McCarry, and tonight I am joined by somebody who is all the way over in New Jersey. We have Mr. Brandon Da Cruz. How are we, buddy?
I'm doing well, my friend. I appreciate you having me back on.
I know, man. The first episode went down pretty well. We had, lots of tags, lots of shares, lots of people. Even when we started promoting it in like the few days or weeks before, a lot of people were coming onto the podcast and then, are coming onto my Instagram, and I was like, hey, how did you find my profile? They're like, oh, I seen Brandon's coming on your podcast. He's awesome. I can't wait to listen to it. So like, people out there love the stuff you put out, whether it's on your own Instagram, your own podcasts, and all these guest appearances, man. So I'm excited to knuckle down, man. But first of all, how have you been since the last podcast? Everything good your side?
Yeah, everything's going well, man. It's been a busy few months. And it's funny that we just discussed this, that it's been like 2 or 3 months since we've been on the line together. And honestly, it's flown by, man. So that's a good thing. I always say to people, being busy is a blessing and pressure is a privilege. Because a lot of people think like when they're busy or they're overwhelmed or they have a lot of pressure on them, that these are negative things. And like we were speaking about prior, your perceptions and your perspective precede your actions and everything you do in life. So I'm all about reframing my mindset around things. And when I'm busy and time is flying by, I take it as an indication that I've been productive and that good things are coming my way.
Absolutely, my man. Absolutely. Well, there's definitely some good things coming the way with this topic today. And it's actually something that we haven't covered. I think we're about, 70, 80 episodes deep in the O Show now, and nobody's talked about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to throw it to you now. We're going to talk about metabolic adaptation, right? And we were just speaking before about, what way we might go through this, but let's talk about the difference between, let's talk about the myth of metabolic damage, first of all, because it's completely different to what we're going to talk about, which is metabolic adaptation. And let's talk about what metabolic damage is or was perceived to be and why it's a myth.
Yeah, I think it's important to start off the topic of metabolic adaptation by differentiating what metabolic damage and what starvation mode is perceived to be and what metabolic adaptation actually is. Because a lot of times we see people within the fitness community or even just, lifestyle clients, Gen Pop clients, and they confuse one to be the same. And they're completely two separate things. One, metabolic adaptation being something that we see within the literature, it's scientifically proven, and one that's actually been completely debunked. However, I always say to people, if you say a lie enough, it becomes a truth, or it becomes perceived as the truth. So with something like metabolic damage and especially starvation mode, this is essentially a myth that was highly popularized, especially when I first started getting into coaching, which was almost a decade ago. This was something I was hearing left and right. Yeah. And it's still something, unfortunately, that's perpetuated by many within this industry today. So starvation mode, just to go into it, is essentially the idea that the more you diet, the more your metabolism slows down to the point that it will eventually come to a halt, where you'll essentially not be able to lose any weight. And a lot of people will often say that you will actually gain weight, even if you're in a calorie deficit, because you've damaged your metabolism. And now over the years, I've worked as a coach for close to 10 years at this point. I've had countless people come to me who are under the impression that they've permanently damaged their metabolism through their past diets or through periods of caloric restriction, or especially in terms of, former competitors. They'll come to me and say, hey, I did this long season a few years ago. My metabolism has never been the same since. And this leads them to believe that they're unable to lose fat and are pretty much destined to stay at a higher body fat percentage than they desired as a result of their metabolism being like, quote unquote, broken. Now, what I always try to do is I always try to make it clear with these people when discussing this topic and remind them that literally no one on this earth is immune or exempt from starvation. So there's no way that you wouldn't lose weight from eating in a true deficit. Plus, we've seen in the literature that both metabolic damage and starvation mode have been disproven multiple times, even dating back to like the early 1940s in the Ansel Keys Minnesota semi-starvation study. So this is where we differentiate the two, because although starvation mode and metabolic damage do not exist, metabolic adaptation is a real thing, and it's something we're all going to experience at some point if you go deep enough into a diet. So really what I try to get across to people is we need to differentiate the two. You need to realize, I know what you've heard, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of coaches that prey upon this. Unfortunately, they'll tell clients, listen, you have metabolic damage, let me do a metabolic reboot program. Or we see all these like things where, I'm going to boost your metabolism this amount of percent. And these are marketing ploys. There are things that can help enhance your metabolism, but that's the health of the organism in general. It's not that you have damage, it's that you're down-regulated. And that's where we get into the topic of metabolic adaptation.
Yeah. And when you're talking about, these people who believe that they've got something wrong with their metabolism and people are preying on that, and like it makes me cringe when you talk about it. But like, how much will that belief that somebody has in their mind that their metabolism is damaged, how much will that affect their ability to lose weight, right? Because if they think they've got a damaged metabolism, it's going to spill over into their efforts to lose weight, right?
So it's interesting. Often when I'll talk to clients about their self-limiting beliefs, whether they think they're fat or they think they have metabolic damage, they think that there's a dysfunction with them, and that's a really flawed way of thinking, because it is putting essentially a rate limiter on your progress and your amount of success. And we see that with the placebo effect. So for instance, there was this is a little bit in a different realm of the nutrition industry, but there was a recent study done on type 2 diabetics taking a glucose solution. So they had two groups of participants come into the lab, and they essentially gave them the same drink. However, how they labeled the drink was completely different. So in actuality, the researchers had put 15 grams of glucose solution, so 15 grams of carbohydrates, in a liquid form, into like a milkshake looking thing. And they told the one group that it was a high sugar, high fat milkshake. So it was labeled with the calorie content that it had hundreds of grams of carbs, this, that, and the other. And the other one was labeled as a sugar-free milkshake. So they were giving two different, controlled, or two different types of interventions. And then they monitored their blood glucose after their excursions. And on both shakes being exactly the same, they both had 15 grams of carbs at 60 calories in the shake itself. The group that was told that they had a high sugar solution actually had a blood glucose reading of 20 milligrams per deciliter higher than the group that got the exact same thing. So that just shows you, and the peak was much, much higher and stayed in terms of the postprandial. So the after meal effect of that blood glucose was much higher. So that shows how this is not just physiology. I always try to get across to people, you cannot separate physiology from psychology. If you believe something is inherently fattening, if you believe you're metabolically damaged, it's going to limit your actions. And then also it's going to make you think that things that you're seeing across, along the way, when you do realize metabolic adaptation, you say, I thought I was in a 500 calorie deficit, but I'm not losing a pound a week. They automatically think something's wrong with me. And they think either they have to stop, or they have to stop dieting, or that dieting doesn't work. And we often hear that people say calorie counting doesn't work, or doesn't, calories in versus calories out is a myth. No, it's because you're not realizing all the things on the back end. And it is that your mind does play a massive role in what you're going to do and the success you're going to ultimately have. So that's why I really try to get across to people when I do hear, I see other practitioners on social media, or I'm at seminars, or I'm just dealing with one-on-one clients. I'm like, listen, let's first address the psychological aspect, and let's talk about some of the beliefs you have and some of the mythology that you've dug into. I'll explain it from my perspective as someone that's coached up almost like 1,000 people at this point. And then I'll send you the research so you can see, hey, listen, metabolic damage doesn't exist. And there is no such thing as starvation mode. There is an adaptive response to the body. That's metabolic adaptation. But we see that clearly in the literature, and it's something to be expected.
Yeah. Perfect, man. And if we are throwing out this word metabolic damage, right, and we're replacing it with metabolic adaptation. So let's clear that up for people who aren't clear on it right now. Like, what is the difference? Why metabolic adaptation, and what does that mean rather than metabolic damage?
Absolutely. So essentially, when we lose weight, many will acknowledge that our metabolic rate should drop a bit as a result of being lighter. So essentially, we're a lighter, leaner individual, so our bodies don't need to burn as many calories per day to maintain our daily functions, as a lighter body requires less energy. So that's well known. However, the research shows that we actually experience a larger drop in metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure than we'd expect to see just from the amount of weight and body fat loss. And that's what's known as metabolic adaptation, or also known as adaptive thermogenesis. On an average, we see about a 15% reduction in total calories burned per day than we'd expect if you've lost 10% more or 10% or greater than your body weight. So say, for instance, you're a 200-pound male. If you lose over 20%, we can expect to see about a 15% reduction. And now there's three components of metabolic adaptation in and of itself. There is the slowing or the downregulation of your metabolism. There is hormonal changes we see, and then there's mitochondrial changes. So essentially, the first thing that we see off the bat when we go into a deficit and we start experiencing these metabolic adaptations is that our metabolism slows down. So now most people think of their metabolism as just their resting metabolic rate. But really, your metabolism encompasses all the chemical processes your body goes through and is comprised of 4 different components of what's called your total daily energy expenditure. So this total comes from both your resting and your non-resting energy expenditures, meaning the calories you burn just to power your body at rest and the calories you burn through physical activity of any sort. So from like a metabolic side, you would see a decrease in each aspect of your total daily energy expenditure, which include, a decrease in your resting metabolic rate, a decrease in the thermic effect of feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis, a decrease in NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and the last one is a decrease in exercise activity thermogenesis. And it's important to realize that it's never just one side of the coin. It's never just one side of the equation that gets downregulated during diet, because a lot of people will say, my metabolism is broken, and they're referring to the resting metabolic rate. However, there's many other components that actually comprise metabolic adaptation. And when we actually look into the literature, we only see about 5% reduction in our resting metabolic rate besides what we've lost from weight. So we see about a 5% decrease more than we'd expect to see just based off the weight that we lost from your resting metabolic rate. But what makes up the majority of metabolic adaptation actually comes from our NEAT, which is something that, it's subconscious, we'll go into it, but a lot of people don't consider. So they don't realize that really what they're seeing when we speak about metabolic adaptation or a stall in fat loss, or having a much more difficult time losing body fat and losing weight, is because they're moving less, either whether it be consciously to compensate for the lack of energy, or it's subconsciously. So then when we look into the 4 components of your resting metabolic rate, or of your total daily energy expenditure, we'll go through how each one gets affected essentially with metabolic adaptation, because they are very different from each other. So right off the bat, your resting metabolic rate, this is what people are most interested in. And this accounts for approximately 60% of your total daily energy expenditure. And resting metabolic rate essentially refers to the amount of energy needed to keep you functioning at rest. Just to really, if you were just bed rest, that's how they measure resting metabolic rate. So the reason RMR lowers when you start dieting is because you're losing body mass, which is metabolically active tissue, which burns calories in and of itself, and you're essentially becoming a leaner, lighter individual. So like I said prior, we should expect that we need less energy just to keep the lights on, However, when we diet, there is that process called adaptive thermogenesis, which takes place and describes the fact that the amount of energy reduction we see in our resting metabolic rate exceeds what we'd expect based purely off the amount of weight that we lost. So like I said, there usually is, on average in most studies, between a 3 to 5% reduction in the resting metabolic rate, more than we'd expect to see just based off the amount of weight that you lost during the diet. But that's only 5%. Like I said, we see 15% on average reduction in totality of your total daily energy expenditure. So it's only accounting for a very small component. Now, the next component that a lot of people overlook in terms of adaptive thermogenesis or metabolic adaptation is the thermic effect of feeding. So the next component of your metabolism that gets downregulated is the TEF, essentially. And this is the energy your body must burn through thermogenesis, or essentially heat production, to digest, assimilate, and release the energy in the food you eat. And it generally accounts for about 10% of your total daily energy expenditure. Now, what's interesting about this, and very few people I ever hear speak about this, is your TEF actually goes down the first day you go into a diet. So say, like, let's do a hypothetical equation. let's say that you want to lose a pound a week, and we have that 3,500 calorie deficit rule for the week. So every day, say you do an even split across the week, you go into a 500 calorie deficit. Well, from day one of your diet, when you're eating 500 calories less than you were at maintenance, you're now burning 50 less calories per day as a result of lowering the amount of food that you're taking in, which thus lowers the amount of the thermic effect of feeding. So really, when you think about it logically, if you were in a 500 calorie deficit per day, you actually just went into a 450 calorie deficit per day. A lot of people don't consider that and realize, hey, we have to account for that, because that's why, off the bat, someone will lose 1 pound a week, maybe the first few weeks. All of a sudden it starts slowing down. Well, the deficit you thought you created is no longer the deficit that you're actually in, because your body is adapting to it, and it actually adapts to it the first day off the bat. So these are things that I'm always trying to get people to think about. We have to take an all-encompassing approach to understanding metabolic adaptation, realizing it's not just your resting metabolic rate. It's the reason that you have difficult time losing fat is not due to you having a slow metabolism, which is another misconception. So then the third component of your metabolism that's downregulated during a diet is the NEAT, your NEAT levels. And NEAT refers pretty much to all physical activity that isn't intentional exercise. So this includes your activities of daily living, fidgeting, speaking with your hands like I'm doing now. Like, I'm half Italian, so I'm constantly speaking with my hands. I'm burning energy doing this, whether you realize it or not. Adjusting your posture, tapping your feet, your steps, and pretty much everything you do physically besides the purposeful training you do in the gym or the cardio you do on a treadmill. Now, here's the thing with NEAT, and a lot of people don't consider it. It's actually the most variable thing between individuals, and the most modifiable or changeable component of our energy expenditure, and can vary between 15% and 25% of the amount of calories we burn per day. Now, the thing with NEAT is that many people didn't consider this. I mean, you could probably back me up on this. Did you ever hear about people speaking about step counts 10 years ago? Because I'll tell you, I didn't. No one was really. Yeah. So what's interesting about that is that the term was just coined about 10 years ago by James Levine, a professor. And we see that in studies, actually just recently in 2016, Rosenbaum and Leibel came out with a study that showed that approximately 85 to 90% of what we consider metabolic adaptation actually comes from reductions in NEAT. So when we see that, let's compare that. I spoke about resting metabolic rate. Most people will say, I have a slow metabolism, that's why I have a difficulty losing body fat. But in actuality, that's accounting for about 5% of what we see, whereas NEAT is accounting for 85 to 90%. So that's a much bigger proportion of what's actually causing you to have a more difficult time, because these are a lot of things I'm not going to notice, for the most part, that I'm not speaking with my hands as much. I'm not measuring that. I'm not going to notice that my posture is a little bit slouched when I'm dieting. There's so many things. Like, I'll tell you, I've done many contest preps and diets in the past. And even if I look at video footage of me in the gym or doing presentations, I'm blinking slower. Like, every single thing is downregulated. Now, it's not like I'm gonna be able to increase my blinking, speed to try to compensate for that energy. So this is why it's so modifiable, and we have to look at this, because we've had studies that have shown that the NEAT level between two individuals of the same body weight, sex, and body composition can vary up to 2,000 calories. So that pretty much means that someone could maintain their body weight, someone the same size can maintain their body weight on 2,000 calories per day, while another may maintain that on 4,000 calories per day. And then we also have literature that shows that an individual's energy expenditure can drop by 500 calories or more just due to the impact dieting can have on NEAT levels. So say you were shooting for that 1 pound a week that we were speaking about earlier. Well, if you're someone that has what we consider an adaptive metabolism, and you suffer from that 500 calorie reduction in NEAT, all of a sudden your 500 calorie deficit just got erased. It's negated. And that's why you're maintaining your body weight and you're not seeing you drop on the scale. So it would essentially erase your deficit. But these are things we don't think about. We automatically look towards our metabolism and say, there must be something wrong, or I must be damaged, or this must be because of a prior diet, or calorie counting doesn't work. There's all these other excuses, where it's really just about increasing awareness to what's actually going on in the system. Because anytime you change calories in, it changes calories out. This is an energy balance equation, but it's not linear. It's not like I drop my calories automatically, my energy output is going to stay the same and I'm going to continue losing weight linearly. And that's why I always tell people, dieting is never a linear process. You'll never lose. If you have a goal to lose 30 pounds and you're doing 1 pound a week, it's never going to just take you 30 weeks. There's always going to be these give and takes. There's for every give me, there's a gotcha. So you might lose a couple, a pound a week for the first couple of weeks, and then it might slow down to a half a pound. And then you might have to, change the diet to progress it back up to that 1 pound. And you feel like you're putting in more effort and you're dieting harder just to get the same result that you were previously. But that's part of the process because our bodies are extremely adaptive. And now the last component of the metabolic adaptation equation essentially is your exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the energy we expend doing intentional exercise. And the thing with this is that a lot of people think that this takes up a large, percentage of their calories burned per day, but it actually only accounts for 5 to 10% of the total calories you burn per day. And this is downregulated in the diet, which is really interesting, due to lowered power output. So you can't lift as heavy. We've all noticed that. You can't lift as intensely during a harsh diet. And there's also research that shows that we experience up to a 20% increase in skeletal muscle work efficiency. So what skeletal muscle work efficiency essentially means is your muscles expend less energy to do the same amount of work, which means it lowers, you essentially become better at moving and exercise, both in terms of your weight training and cardio. And this decreases the amount of calories you burn during those exercise sessions. So I just made a post about this yesterday, is that a lot of people overestimate the amount of calories that they burn in terms of their weight training. So really, if we look at the literature, you only see between 60 calories and 300 calories, depending on your weight training volume, on an actual weight training session of how many calories you burn during that session. Now that's down-regulated when you diet. So a lot of people look at like their Apple Watch or their Fitbit, and they'll say that they burned 800 calories in an hour. Or they did a group fitness class, and I burned 600 calories in a 40-minute, boot camp or something.
Yeah.
That the human body doesn't work like that. We generally see it's about 3 calories per minute at the max for men, and about 1.6 calories per minute for females. So we're not burning that many calories. Even if you had maxed out with continuous exercise, like in a high intensity interval session or something of that sort, you're burning very minuscule amount of calories. And that's actually down-regulated even more during a diet. And a lot of people won't realize that. So they'll say, I often see people say, or I'll talk to them about, their calorie intake, and they'll say, well, my maintenance, I believe, is 3,000, but I eat 3,500 calories because I burn 500 extra calories in exercise. So it should be making the equation equal. I should be at energy balance. So I always go back to those people and I say, well, are you maintaining your weight on that? They're like, no, actually, I'm gaining weight. You're in surplus. You're not burning as much as you think. You might be burning 200 calories, but you're still in that 300 calorie surplus throughout the course of the week, every single day. So this is where all these changes happen on the metabolic side and lead us to other changes that happen hormonally.
Yeah, awesome, man. And when you were talking there, it got me thinking about the whole, I guess it's a myth as well. People get older, right? And they think that, oh, my metabolism's just shot because I'm 40 now. I'm not like whenever I was 30. But in reality, it's because what happens whenever you move through your 20s into your 30s is you move up the career ladder, so you're probably moving less. You're more desk bound through your day. You have kids, so you're not maybe playing sports that you were in the evening. You're not maybe going to the gym as often as you were before. So these normal 9-to-5 office workers who aren't like training properly or following a diet, they think their metabolism is stuffed because they've just like, it's been 5 years since their prime. But in reality, it's just that they're moving less, and all these adaptations are happening because of the fact that their metabolism is down-regulating because they're moving less and different components that we just talked about. And that's what's happening over the years, rather than the metabolism actually just being an age-related thing where suddenly you get to 30 or 35 or 40 and it's like, oh, well, you know what happens when you get to 40, your metabolism just goes to shit. It's not really that. It's all the behaviors and all the habits that they do and what makes up their metabolism. All these different components all factor in together, right?
100%. Yeah, I see that quite commonly. I see that even in young people. I'll have 30-year-olds come to me and say, listen, I don't lose weight and I'm not able to stay as lean as I did in my college years, so in my 20s. And I always go back to them and I say, all right, so we do see a reduction in resting metabolic rate as we age. And it's very small. If you were to use, say, like a general calorie calculator, like a Mifflin St. Jour, where you use a Harris Benedict, and you put in your same anthropometrics, meaning your same body weight, your same height, your same biological sex, and then you put in the age 20 compared to the age 30, we might see a reduction of 50 to 100 calories with the aging process. However, that's not enough to account for you gaining pounds of fat. So what I always try to come back to people is it's not your metabolism that's slow, it's your NEAT levels that are low. You know what I mean? It's really that it's coming back down to the fact that you're moving substantially less. And that's where I go over the behavioral component like you hit on. I'll tell them, listen, when you were in college, I'll ask them just general questions. In college, what were you doing actively? How often were you exercising? Well, I was in the gym 6 days a week. Well, how often do you exercise now? I only have time for 3 days a week. Okay, so you probably are carrying less muscle tissue first and foremost. So we know that affects your resting metabolic rate. So yes, your metabolism is a little bit slower. And also, how active were you? You were going out at night, you were walking around campus, you might have been walking to a job, you were very active. Now you're in an office 9 to 5, like you said, and you're extremely sedentary. And I saw that in myself. I took a corporate position a few years ago, and I had been competing for years. And I noticed that all of a sudden, my maintenance calories were between 34 and 3,600 calories per day prior to that. And all of a sudden, I'm eating 34 to 3,600 calories as usual. I'm very dialed in with all my nutrition, tracking things. I've been doing this a long time. I was gaining weight. So all of a sudden, I started readjusting things, and I had to reestablish my baseline. And my new maintenance calories were between 28 and 2,900. And so all of a sudden, I lost, 500 to 700 calories. And that was just due to the fact that I was moving substantially less. And that was around the time that I started looking into the research on NEAT, and started using, one of the first Fitbits that had come out, and started tracking these things. And I noticed, wow, I was moving substantially more previous to that, because on weekends I would see I'd hit 15,000 steps. Then I'm in the office, I'm hitting 5,000 for the day. Yeah. So it's a substantial difference. You know what I mean? Like I hit on, people see reductions of up to 500 calories. That could equate to a pound gained a week. So it's substantial. These are things that we have to take into consideration. But the next aspect of metabolic adaptation would be the hormonal changes we see. And this is something that a lot of people are interested in, especially guys that, they're trying to compete, guys and girls that are competing, because hormones obviously affect the energy balance equation. And a lot of times we have these arguments, is it calories in versus calories out, or is it hormones? And it's a mix of both. They both affect each other. So the first hormonal change that we see during a diet is actually a decrease in a hormone called leptin. So leptin is a hormone that acts as the main regulator of both your appetite and satiety, as well as your energy expenditure levels, and is the most influential hormone involved in metabolic adaptation. So we see that leptin levels fall quite substantially within days of entering a deficit. So we'll often see a substantial reduction within 4 to 5 days, and then it will continue to drop, but not at the same rate, as the body will get adapted to being in a deficit. So it's not as a significant shock to the body. So we've even seen that leptin drops in cases of fasting. So if you were to do like a fasting protocol for a few days, you'll see a substantial decrease in leptin. And when you restore energy balance and you go back to eating, it will increase. So leptin is controlled essentially by 2 different factors. It's the size of our fat cells, as leptin is secreted by adipose or fat tissue, and then what's called short-term energy flux, which is essentially just how many calories we're taking in on a daily basis. So like I said, in the case of fasting, you might have not dropped any body fat during the period of 1 to 2 days of not eating, but you didn't have any energy coming in, so your body has responded with a survival response. Now, the reason leptin is so important within metabolic adaptation is it plays a major role as a feedback and signaling mechanism to the hypothalamus. And what the hypothalamus is essentially our control center in the brain. So when leptin levels are high, it signals to our brain that we have a sufficient amount of energy, and it allows for us to feel satiated, with our meals, have normal levels of appetite. It helps with activity and movement, and then also hormone production. However, when we go into a deficit and our leptin levels drop, it starts sending a signal to the brain that is perceived by the hypothalamus as a sign of energy deficiency, which in our body, remember, we're a survival mechanism. We're an adaptive organism. So this is perceived as like a famine or potential case of starvation. So now your body looks to slow down its metabolic rate and the metabolic processes as a survival mechanism and as a way to conserve calories. So then what happens here is once leptin lowers, it causes a huge cascade in events which essentially affect both our sex hormones, our stress hormones, and our hunger hormones. So first we see, a lot of people are most interested in the sex hormones, talk about testosterone, estrogen, things of that sort. And during a diet, we see that testosterone decreases. And this will often manifest as hypogonadism in males and a loss in sex drive and libido. So we've seen, like in natural case bodybuilding case studies, that these guys are pretty much like, they need to get on TRT, essentially. They're at critically low levels of testosterone. Now, this is restored once you go into a state of energy balance. You restore and you get out of a deficit, but we see that their testosterone drops significantly, that and free test. Estrogen, same thing. We see a massive decrease in estrogen, which is one of the main reasons why we see that some women, if they get lean enough, will lose their menstrual cycle. And then the last one that really affects your metabolic rate is our thyroid production decreases on the hormone side. So what we see here is that TSH will rise to signal that we need more thyroid output, but our conversion of T4 to T3, which T3 is our metabolically active thyroid that plays the biggest role in our metabolic rate, will be interrupted due to the stress of the calorie deficit, which actually, if you were to run blood work like I do with my clients during a deficit, you'll see that they're having lower levels of T3, but they actually have increased levels of reverse T3. So you're seeing that that's pretty much getting caught in cache. It's like the same thing with, if we look at testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin, if sex hormone binding globulin goes high, then you're not going to have as much free test in the circulation to actually, unbound testosterone to use for, muscle building, recovery, all those type of processes. Then the next thing that gets impacted by metabolic adaptation are your stress hormones. So we see, cortisol increase. So, a lot of people don't realize this, but dieting is perceived as a stressor to the body. So it causes this increase in cortisol, which can drastically impact the dieting process. So when cortisol is elevated, it can downregulate the production of, our sex hormones and metabolic hormones. Like we see that the cortisol to testosterone ratio is thrown off, which thus lowers testosterone lower. Cortisol is known to decrease thyroid level, and it also increases our rate of muscle loss. And what's interesting about this is it's not only cortisol, but we see in literature that when you go into a deficit, you will see a blunting of muscle protein synthesis. So your ability to synthesize new protein will be lowered. Now, when you're lean, we see that in both obese and lean individuals. Now, when you're lean, we actually see that muscle protein breakdown or muscle protein degradations increase as well. So what ends up happening with that is you're pretty much in this state where it's harder to rebuild tissue, which is why it's very hard to actually build muscle in a calorie deficit, and why some people do lose a substantial amount of muscle during a deficit or dieting phase. And then what we often see cortisol manifest as is water retention. We've all seen that. You're seeing that the scale is stuck, and we'll often have people that are highly stressed. They're wondering why their weight's going up, and they're in a deficit still. We know that for a fact. They're tracking everything accurately. They're hitting their steps. They're training hard. And they're wondering why their weight's falling, but they're holding like this edema essentially. And that is from the increase in cortisol, which is why it's so important to, like we'll speak on later, to have stress mitigation strategies, to have refeed days, to manage your stress through stress management practices like we spoke on the last episode. These are so important because the body doesn't want to be super shredded or lean. It wants survival. So it's going to send all these different signals to the body. Hey, listen, put this to a halt. You're going to increase water retention. You're going to have higher hunger signaling. You're going to experience all these perturbations or these changes, which make the dieting process harder. But if you know how to mitigate them or know how to attenuate them, it's going to make it a lot more of a successful process, and one that's a little bit easier for you to stick to and be successful in, which is obviously our ultimate goal. Now, the last hormones that are impacted by metabolic adaptation are our hunger hormones. And now everyone on a diet has experienced this. This is completely natural. I always try to get across to people. Listen, hunger is a natural response to being underfed. If you're going into a deficit, you're essentially, if you're under your maintenance calories, you are taking in less than your body needs to essentially run at 100% capacity, to run on all cylinders. So we see during a deficit that as leptin decreases, like I said, leptin is a satiety signal. It skews our satiety signals. So what we see is an increase in ghrelin, which is our main hunger hormone, which increases and drives appetite. And then we also see other like satiety-related hormones that are similar to leptin, like PYY and insulin decrease. And then we also see during dieting that it's been shown that gut satiety hormones like CCK and GLP-1 are blocked, which actually don't allow for appropriate fullness signals to be sent to the brain. So I always try to get across the client. Sometimes we'll have a refeed day or we'll do a diet break, and they say, I'm eating these larger meals, but I'm not feeling as full. And we've all experienced that post-show, for instance, where you've done a diet and post-diet, you go out and have a huge meal and you feel like you could just like eat endlessly, like you have an enormous appetite that's ravenous and it's never ending. And it's because we have these blocking of certain satiety hormones that would generally signal to the brain, listen, we're done, we're good on food. But because these receptors and these signals are blocked, we're not getting that same thing. So that's where I always try to get across to people. If you're going to have a refeed, or you're going to have an off-plan meal, or you're going to have a post-show indulgence, eat to satisfaction and eat with mindfulness. Don't eat till you're bursting full, because that signal's thrown off in the body. So if you eat till you're bursting full, you're definitely going to overdo it. We see that so often where people blow out their diet, immediately post diet, they gain 10, 20 pounds, in the coming weeks, they essentially go back to where they were, or even worse off, they gain more fat than they lost in the process of dieting itself.
Yeah, wow. So, man, like there's so much going on hormonally that happens as a result of, this adaptation to the metabolism. And there's a lot more, I think, than people realize, because if you look at Instagram, you look at a lot of stuff, like people will probably be listening, they'll have heard of leptin and ghrelin, right? But they don't think about what's happening with their sex hormones. They don't think about what's happening with their cortisol. They don't think about so many other things, but it all comes together, right? And it's a big picture, and it all influences the other things. So like you said, it's not just calories or hormones, it's both, because the hormones are impacting the whole calories in, calories out equation, and vice versa.
100%. Yeah, we try to get across to people. There is never a one size fits all protocol, and there's never one blame or one causal blame. So what we have to look at it is it's an all encompassing system. So when people try to, put different aspects in silos, they say it's your hormones that are messed up, that's why you can't lose weight, or it's calories in versus calories out, that's why you can't lose weight. We have to realize that one affects the other. So for instance, calories in versus calories out, you go into a deficit, it impacts your hormones. Now, if your hormones get downregulated, it's going to impact your response to food. So if your testosterone's lowered, your cortisol's higher, you're losing less, or you're losing more muscle, now your ability to synthesize protein is going to be downregulated. Your ability to respond to the same calorie deficit is going to be downregulated. So there's so many different aspects. Like from the hormonal aspect, think about it just in terms of what we were speaking about, the hunger hormones. Well, all of a sudden, if your hunger hormones are through the roof and you don't have mitigation strategies to help, or you don't understand that that's a natural response, you might take it. I have a lot of clients that have said, I felt like I needed to eat more, so I went off the diet because I felt extremely hungry. So I thought that was, a survival response, or I thought that was my body telling me I needed more. It is, however, it's a natural response. So it's something we have to fight, or we have to manage with different strategies, instead of just every time we feel hungry, just giving into that and saying, oh, our body needs it. Well, if we gave our body exactly what we needed, we'd stay at maintenance. We wouldn't lose body fat. We wouldn't get to our goal physique, our goal body composition. So we have to, like I said, for every give me, there's a gotcha. So you go into a deficit, it affects your hormones. Your hormones then affect, the energy intake, because it drives you to want to eat more. So these are all things that there's interplay between both sides of the equation, and we can't just minimally reduce these things to it's one thing or it's another thing. It's always more complex than many people think. And unfortunately, we see on social media, people will just kind of glamorize, or they'll just put a spotlight on one aspect, because that's a simple story. Let's think about it. Like, that's an easier way to say, listen, it's your hormones, and I am an integrated medical professional, and that's what I specialize in. I could fix you. I could get you to lose weight just by addressing your hormones. But if you're still in, a calorie surplus, you're not going to lose body fat. We know that from, law of thermodynamics. So it's like we have to take a multi-pronged approach to dieting, to understanding. And that's where I always come with, I want people to understand the process before we go into it. These are the expectations. And I always say, and I suggest other coaches do the same, that I set certain expectations for my clients. These are things, I want you to understand metabolic adaptation. I don't want you to fear this stuff. The reason I educate people on this is not to put fear in them. It's actually to do the reverse. I'm trying to educate them in the fact that, hey, these are things we need to look out for. These are natural processes in the body. However, let's keep these in mind when we see these certain side effects. You see a loss of libido. You see that you're retaining water. Let's then utilize the strategies that I know of to help mitigate them, so that you're not experiencing them as much, but you were aware of it, so you don't think something's wrong. You know that this is a natural response.
Yeah, 100%, man. And then within metabolic adaptation, what else? We've talked about, the metabolic changes, the hormonal changes. What else may happen in the body as you go through a dieting phase and the metabolism starts to change and adapt then?
Yeah, so the last part of the metabolic adaptation equation is we see a change in mitochondrial efficiency. So when you diet, your body starts to look for ways to become more efficient, so it can burn less calories than you're taking in, because it wants to conserve the calories you are taking in the best it can. So one of the ways that it does this is it increases mitochondrial efficiency. So essentially, increased mitochondrial efficiency means that, it'll essentially make it so that we're utilizing less energy to create mitochondria from the food that we're, to create ATP from the food that we're eating. So we're expending less calories in the process to conserve that energy. And this lowers our overall total daily energy expenditure. So even if we just think about it from like a food perspective, like I said, thermic effective feeding, if you're in 1,000-calorie deficit, you lost approximately 100 calories off the bat. So that's an increase in mitochondrial efficiency. The body's trying to do everything it can to conserve energy, which lowers that deficit. So a lot of times people will say, I put myself in a 25% deficit, or I put myself in a 500-calorie deficit, but your body has these stop gaps in place to make sure that a 500-calorie deficit never is a 500-calorie deficit. So that partially is done through mitochondrial efficiency.
Awesome. And with all this going on in the body then, Brandon, like, what can somebody do either as a coach or somebody who's going through a diet phase themselves? Like, what can we look out for? What ways can we sort of look to stop these changes happening, or at least minimize, I guess is the word I'm looking for, minimize the impact that these will have on their progress?
Absolutely. So it's important to note that we can't completely avoid these. These are natural responses in the body. This was made evolutionarily so we could survive. So this is something that I always tell people, I'm never going to be able to give you a protocol that's going to reverse metabolic adaptation if you want to lose body fat, because the only way to reverse metabolic adaptation is to go back into energy balance, go back to maintenance calories, or into a surplus. So to restore the energy in the system. However, there are many strategies that we could take to minimize the effects of metabolic adaptation. The first thing I generally like to start with is a slower rate of loss. So a lot of times, what people will do is they'll go into an aggressive deficit off the bat because they want to see results. And I completely understand that. But slower weight loss has been shown to minimize the amount of lean body mass loss. And that's a huge component, because if you lose lean body mass, which is mostly comprised of muscle, you're going to lose, percentages off of your resting metabolic rate. So by going into and using a smaller, more acute deficit, you're going to attenuate some of the hormonal changes we see because you're not impacting your hormones as much. It's going to help you maintain training performance so that you're going to be able to not only burn more calories at the gym, but maintain more of that metabolically active muscle tissue. It helps to maintain NEAT levels from dropping as quickly, because we see with NEAT is that as you go into a deeper and deeper deficit, NEAT levels drop more and more. And like I said, that's a subconscious aspect. Now we could track our steps, but there's so many different aspects, from blinking to fidgeting to posture, that we cannot account for during a diet that are getting downregulated. So by going into a less aggressive deficit, now we see people doing rapid fat loss phases. If it's a very short period of time, you're going to experience metabolic adaptation, but it's not going to be as substantial. However, if you're doing it in a very chronic, like we see yo-yo dieters or people that do crash dieting for extended periods of time, you're going to incur these metabolic adaptations much, much quicker. So my whole thing is I shoot with most of my clients for about 0.5 to 1% body weight loss per week, and generally between a 15 to 20% deficit. And generally the highest I'll go is a 25% calorie deficit, which is still on the moderate side. Where we see a lot of these metabolic adaptations in the research are between 40 and 50% calorie deficits. So that's where we really start seeing people having, drastic effects off the bat. Their leptin levels are, when we do blood work, they're crashing within a few days. We're seeing a downregulation in hormones much quicker. Generally, if you notice, a lot of people, they do more of a moderate approach to dieting. They feel better the first couple of weeks, especially if you're in a surplus. Like I know with my own clients, a lot of times when I take them out from a maintenance or a surplus phase, like a growth phase, and I put them in a moderate deficit, their training performance goes up, their aerobic conditioning goes up, their endurance goes up. So we're getting better training sessions. I'm able to recomp a lot of these individuals the first half of their diet, and then we get into the deeper ends of the diet and they start incurring metabolic adaptation. But my whole thing is, let's start with a slower rate of loss so that you can minimize the muscle loss, because let's think about it. It's not just about weight loss. We have to really differentiate these two things. When you're looking to change your body composition and improve your physique, it should be about fat loss and muscle retention, not just total weight loss. So that's where I try to take an emphasis off the scale. The scale is one metric to track progress, but it's not the end all be all. Let's look at your body composition. Let's look at your tape measurements. Let's look at your training performance. Let's monitor all these things to ensure that we're not going too aggressively off the bat. The next thing that I'm very big on, I'm constantly driving home to clients, is to maintain NEAT. So like I said, this is the most modifiable component of our total daily energy expenditure. And it's also the one that's impacted by metabolic adaptation the most. So maintaining this is crucial to keeping expenditure up. So with me, I'm tracking steps with clients. I'm using, I'm generally setting a baseline. So for instance, if they were in a maintenance phase or they were in a growth phase prior to the diet, I'm having them track daily what their steps are, and I'm finding a baseline. So if a client, their baseline's at 8,000, when we go into a deficit, we're not dropping below that 8,000, especially as we know that we become more efficient through the process and meat drops so substantially, we can't afford to be under that 8,000 because you're going to burn less calories regardless. So we need to keep that minimum baseline of physical activity. The next thing is to take as smart of a training approach as possible. And this is done for multiple reasons. We first want to preserve as much lean body mass as possible. We see, there's a big misconception of how much calories muscle burns. A lot of people think that muscle burns like 50 calories per pound. Actually, if you look at the statistics, and the actual research study, it burns 6.5 calories per pound. So I know that's a little bit disappointing to people out there. But if we really look at it, for every kilogram, so I'll do it for you guys, kilogram, you burn 13 calories for every pound of muscle you have. Now, for every pound of fat tissue you have, you burn 4.5 calories. So there's about a threefold, difference. So we want to maintain lean body mass. We want to lose fat mass. So we do that mostly through the stimulus of training. So I want people resistance training regularly, which also helps to increase or offset the increase in muscle efficiency that decreases our energy expenditure from exercise. So we actually see that weight training, when we take individuals that are dieting, we put them in a condition where they're doing regular resistance training, actually decreases some of that energy expenditure loss that we have, and not just from the calorie burning component of weight training. It actually makes sure that your muscle is less efficient at movements than it would be at cardio and other things. And then what I'm trying to do with people is focus on maintaining an adequate stimulus to maintain or build muscle. So I'm always telling my clients, we're not looking at your training sessions as a way to burn calories, because I see a lot of people, they make the mistake of, they transition their training, they completely change it when they go to a dieting phase. They'll increase volume, they'll increase repetitions per set, they'll decrease rest periods. So they kind of make it almost like an aerobic workout. They're making it like a circuit training. They're doing giant sets and all these things. And there's a time and place for everything. We have to realize if you're putting less energy into the system, you're going to have less energy to work with, essentially. So why would you try to increase the amount of volume or the amount of repetitions that you're doing when that wasn't what built the muscle? I always tell people, dance with the one that brought you. Essentially what built it will preserve it or keep it. So let's keep the same type of training stimulus and modify it as necessary based on your biofeedback. The next thing that we would do is go into like someone's dietary setup and macronutrient distribution. So first and foremost, I always say protein is king. So I want people to eat a higher protein diet. This will help with both retaining your muscle, and it also increases the thermic effect of feeding, as protein has a thermic effect of feeding of 20 to 30%. So essentially, if you take in 100 calories from protein, you're essentially only absorbing 70 of those calories, 70, 80 of those calories as in comparison to fat, which has a thermic effect about 0 to 3%, or carbohydrates that have a thermic effect of 5 to 10%. So you see there's a massive discrepancy. So we really want to maintain that high protein. Protein also is extremely satiating. So it's going to help with hunger levels. It's going to help with preservation of lean body tissue. It has so many effects. And like I said, we see that there's a drop in muscle protein synthesis and a drop in muscle, or an increase in muscle protein breakdown. So we have to make sure that we have the building blocks, those amino acids, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis adequately throughout the course of the day. The next thing I go to is the next essential nutrient. So that would be fat. So we want to make sure we have an adequate fat intake for the absorption of fat soluble vitamins and for hormone production, because we know hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. So from there, I suggest that you fill in the rest of your calories from carbs to maintain performance. We really want to, we know that if you're doing weight training, it's glycolytic work. So it runs off of glycolysis, which is carbohydrate metabolism. So we want to make sure that you have enough fuel substrate in the system. So I'll generally, partition more of the extra calories that I have for clients towards carbohydrates. And there's so many benefits with carbohydrates, being that they, insulin helps to limit muscle protein breakdown. So it's going to help with that anti-catabolic effect. It might help lower cortisol. It's going to help with stress modulation. So a lot of times, if someone is retaining water or super stressed, I might give them a refeed day or a high carb day. It's these different strategies. And then the other thing that I really try to look to do is increase the amount of food volume. So really what we're looking to do is we're going to a calorie deficit, but that doesn't mean you eat less food. It means you eat less calories. And that's where we leverage things like energy density. So I'll change the energy density of the foods that people are eating so that, for instance, if they're on a higher calorie meal plan and for every gram of food, it's 2 calories per gram, I might lower that to 1.5 calories per gram or even 1 calorie per gram. And with that, they're able to eat double the food volume, which will increase satiation from the foods that they're eating. However, they're still in a net deficit. So a lot of times when I take people into a deficit right off the bat, I'm literally exchanging their food sources, and they're eating as much or more food than they were, but I've put them in a deficit. So they don't even realize that they're in a deficit because they feel fuller, which is a big thing in terms of managing those hunger signals and the, satiety, which is, we know, diets work. We know that a calorie deficit works, but if you can't adhere to it, it's not going to work for you. So we really have to manage that satiation aspect. And then other things that we could do is you got to maintain sleep quality, as sleep quality helps to manage hunger hormone fluctuations, the retention of muscle. We see in literature that if you undersleep, you'll still lose the same amount of weight. So it is a calorie equation. It's calories in versus calories out still works in terms of sleep production and in terms of whether you get good sleep or bad sleep. But when you undersleep, we see that a larger proportion of the amount of weight that you actually lose is from lean body mass or muscle as opposed to fat mass. And when you get high quality sleep, that the opposite is true. So you will retain more muscle mass and you will increase the amount of fat mass that you lose. And then the last thing is managing recovery. So that's a huge thing. A lot of people, they realize that they're in a calorie deficit. They don't feel as good, but they think about training in the aspect of, let's do more. I want to do more. Maybe doing more will help me burn more body fat and things of that sort. We have to realize that if you don't have as much, fuel substrates, you can't expect to continually crank up volume or do high intensity cardio because this is impeding in your recovery capacity. And that's going to leave you more susceptible to feeling like shit and to also losing muscle tissue, which is so important. And then the rest, I tell people, realize the rest is out of your control. So we've done everything. We've hit on nutrition. We've hit on macronutrient distribution. We've hit on steps in daily activity. We've hit on sleep and managing recovery, your training. We have all these things that we've approached it to maximize your body's ability to minimize metabolic adaptation. And then, there are other strategies in terms of hormonal perturbations. So if you are an enhanced athlete, we can replace some of those hormones that are downregulated. So for instance, if you are someone that, I have a lot of older guys that are on TRT. If they weren't on TRT, but they were still low in terms of their testosterone prior to going on a diet, I generally monitor those values as we get into the diet. So I'll monitor maybe 8 weeks in. And if I see that they're under, I'll send them to their doctor, or I'll recommend that they go see their doctor, because just improving that is not going to necessarily improve fat loss directly, but it's going to improve how you feel, your energy levels, your activity levels, your mood, all these different things. It's going to help with the libido loss. Then things like thyroid, you could do thyroid replacement therapy. So things of that sort will help with that. And then obviously, when we get into like the competitive aspect, we're seeing a drop in that resting metabolic rate. So there could be some thermogenic agents that we use, whether that's, caffeine on the natural side, or we use ephedrine or clenbuterol, which will help upregulate your resting metabolic rate so that you're burning more calories to offset that decrease in energy expenditure. So there are multiple strategies that we could use to try to offset all these decreases that we see.
Yeah, man, perfect. And mate, that is the Rolodex of step by step of everything to do, right? That covers everything that you as a top quality coach would implement. But if you're going to pick, like, let's say one thing out of that probably will have the most impact for people who are going through this, like, what would you, if people aren't going to address all these little factors, what would be the biggest thing that could impact a client going through this and have the most bang for your buck in terms of mitigating the metabolic adaptation then?
Yeah, I think people will be surprised my answer on this, but I will tell you, it's neat. It's 100% neat. And the reason for that is because that is what we see drop off the most. So for instance, when we see in literature about metabolic adaptation, we generally see, even in a substantial amount of weight loss, meaning between 10% to 20% loss of weight loss, we only see about 100 calorie decrease in resting metabolic rate as compared to what they would expect based off the weight loss itself. So that's 100 calories. Say that you go into an aggressive deficit. and you do 1,000-calorie deficit. That's only 100 calories that you lost from the thermic effect of feeding. So now we have resting metabolic rate of 100 calories on average lost. We have thermic effect of feeding, 100 calories lost. But with NEAT, like I hit on, it could be up to 500 calories. And then also we see that people of the same body size, composition, and biological sex have a difference of up to 2,000 calories. And it takes up so many of these aspects, and it's something that you can easily incorporate into your day. So for instance, for me, I'll have myself and clients go for walks after meals. I'll have them in the office. If I have an office worker, I'll tell them, listen, every hour, I just want you to get up for 2 to 5 minutes and just walk around, just go for a bathroom break. I just want you moving. And it's that daily activity that's not only increasing your NEAT, which increases obviously your energy expenditure, but there's so many knock-on effects. I've done a lot of podcasts on what's called high energy flux and the benefits of that. It's going to help with your glucose metabolism. So after meals, it'll help with lowering blood glucose excursion. So you're managing your insulin sensitivity better. It actually, higher levels of activity, so just steps in general, have been shown to regulate appetite and satiety signals better. So we have studies even back from the 50s with Bengali mill workers that those that are office workers that are sedentary and that have low levels of physical activity actually out-eat the amount of expenditure, the amount of calories they burn per day. But as you go up the continuum from the low to the moderate to the high activity levels, so the high activity levels would be, say, like the laborers, they actually moderate their energy intake naturally without calorie counting, without any of those, without an app, better based on the amount of physical activity that they're doing. So it's going to help you manage hunger better. It's going to help you balance your intake. If you move more, you're going to be able to eat more during a deficit. So a lot of times you won't have to make as harsh of calorie drops. So that's the biggest thing I tell people all the time. It's not just what you're doing in the gym. I try to always frame it back to my clients. I say, listen, for instance, how many hours a week do you think that most of your clients train on average? In the gym?
In the gym, probably 4 or 5 hours.
Okay, 4 or 5 hours. So we're talking one hour, maybe 4 to 5 times a week.
Yep.
Now think about it from a logical perspective. There is, say they sleep 8 hours a day. So that's 9 hours in total that we've taken up. Well, we still have 15 other hours of the day that we could be expending calories. So I always try to bring it back to people. It isn't just the 1 hour a day that you're in the gym or the 1 hour that you're cooking and eating your meals. There's 22 other hours of the day, obviously besides sleep, that you could be doing something. And it's not about being, obsessed with tracking your steps and trying to constantly do like Apple Watch circles and stuff, but it's just about being physically active and doing things that are low hanging fruit. So it's, going for a walk with your dog, taking your kids out to the park. It's parking in the back of a parking lot rather than, when we're dieting and we're super exhausted, that we're waiting for 10 minutes to find the front spot at the grocery store. It's taking the stairs rather than the escalator or the elevator. It's these little things that add up through the course of the day. If you have a local grocery store, or you have a local convenience store, instead of getting in your car and wasting the gas and driving there, if it's a 5-10 minute walk, just take it. You know what I mean? It's these little things that add up through the course of the day, which I've seen substantial benefits with my clientele. When I've had them track their steps, they feel better. It's even just from a recovery capacity because you're getting that blood flow moving. You're helping with nutrient delivery. And it's this low intensity, low level activity, which helps with fatty acid oxidation. So you're burning fat in the process, but it's something that doesn't impact your recovery capacity, actually improves it. It's not draining you physically. It's good for your mental health because we've seen actually in studies that you have better cognition when you move around more, especially like if you were to walk and listen to a podcast or walk and listen to an audiobook, you have better memory retention. So there's so many knock-on effects besides just the calorie burning component, which are going to improve someone's life, give them more of a structure and better habits and behaviors to implement. And it's an easy thing to add in. You know what I mean? If you're maintaining 8,000 steps a day, just continue doing so. Sweep your house every night. Do something just physically active that you don't have to conceptualize as cardio. You don't have to conceptualize as exercise and feel like you're dreading to do it. You're going to have to do a lot of these things by themselves anyway. Take your dog on an extra walk per day. It's going to be good for you and it's going to be good for them.
Yeah, 100%, man, 100%. And I just love how this episode's flowed. It was like the last time, man. You just come on and I just know I can rely on you to just come on and just drop bombs, man. So I literally just steer the conversation a certain way and you just drop the bombs. I'm just sitting here just trying to take it all in. So, mate, I think this episode's going to be an absolute fucking winner. People are going to love it. So thank you for your time, my man. This has been Huge. And I encourage everyone, we done a really good episode about 3 months ago. So if you haven't went back, go back and listen to Brandon's first one, because it was all about the pillars of your coaching. Very similar to this, loads of knowledge bombs dropped, mate. And if people don't follow you, man, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on Instagram at Brandon Da Cruz _. I also have a website, Brandon Da Cruz Fit. And then if you guys need anything in terms of email coaching, any of those type of aspects, feel free to reach out to me at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com.
Perfect, man. Perfect. Well, I think people might be reaching out to you for something, or at least following you on Instagram, hopefully after these, my man. So guys, I really encourage you to check Brandon's stuff out. He does heaps of podcasts, heaps of educational stuff. Some of his posts they make a lot of sense, and they always get a like from me, because he always posts something that is it's just nail on the head sort of things, like an easy little caption. It's like, okay, this just makes sense. So mate, keep doing what you're doing. I'm a big fan of your work, and I thank you for your time tonight.
Absolutely. Oh, I appreciate you having me on. Always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward already to the next one.
Oh man, we'll get another 2 or 3 months from now, and the audience will be gagging for more.
Oh yeah, let me know. Any topic you want to cover, I'm always down to come on, share some education, and especially dispel some myths, because I spent years, I've been doing this a long time. I've been working full-time in this industry for 12 years, and I was deceived too. And I at that point, there wasn't a lot of great information on the internet, especially. There was just forums, and there wasn't podcasts. There was none of this. And I wasted a lot of time. So my whole intention with my clients, with my social media content, with these podcasts, is to really, separate things and kind of dispel some of the bullshit and the myths, and kind of, clarify the confusion in this industry, and just give people good, applicable information that's going to impact their physique, their body, and their lives.
Awesome, man. Awesome. And you know what? I'm just thinking in my head, we might have to get you on to dispel some myths about supplements. Maybe because you've been on Dean McKillop, who's a friend of the podcast. He's been on a few times as well now. Maybe we'll get you guys on for a roundtable if we can hook the time zone differences up, and we'll come on to talk about the myths about supplements, or what's fact and what's myths, I guess.
Absolutely. I'm always down, my friend.
So that you'll probably see that one before the guest list, or the audience listening will probably be seeing that one before you know it, because once I get an idea in my head, we tend to run with it. So, mate, thank you again for your time. We will hook that episode up pretty soon, and I appreciate you, man. So thank you for your time, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Sounds good, my man. Later.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of The O Show. If you know somebody who needs to hear this episode today, please share this with them via message or on social media. Don't forget to also take a screenshot and share it on your story, and tag me at Oren McCarry, so we can continue to grow the podcast and help more people change their lives with the advice given here. Also, keep the 5-star reviews coming over on iTunes, as that helps people who normally wouldn't listen to the show find it and get the O Show in their ears, and drive the podcast forward to help more people around the world with the advice here. Have a great day, and I will speak to you soon.